At exactly 5:47 in the morning, something felt off, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stood still in my kitchen, the only sound a faint drip of coffee hitting the ceramic mug in my hand, still hot, still half full. The sky outside was barely awake, stained in sleepy purples and greyish blues. And there I was, frozen in the faint glow of the hallway light, staring out into the dim silhouette of my backyard, knowing what I'd see before I even looked. There she was again, Lila Davenport, barefoot, wrapped in that same ridiculous pink velour tracksuit with the words "Karma Queen" glittering across the back of her hoodie like a neon sign for chaos. She crept into my yard like a woman on a mission to liberate sweetness from oppression. With the casual confidence of someone who believed she was doing divine work, she marched straight to my honey crate, snatched 2 jars from beneath the cloth, gave a quick glance around, just for flair, not caution, and tiptoed away like she was gifting the world peace, one spoonful at a time. It was the 3rd morning in a row, the 3rd time she'd helped herself without a blink of hesitation. My jaw clenched so hard I thought I might crack a molar. My fingers trembled, and a splash of burning coffee hit the counter. That honey was more than a condiment. It was my quiet pride, my labor, my early mornings swathed in smoke and buzzing wings. It was the aching knees, the stings I never complained about, the hours of nurturing a living system that didn't need praise but demanded patience. And Lila just waltzed in, barefoot and bold, licking her fingers like a satisfied thief. She strutted away like she owned the place, like she owned me. It hadn't started this way. When I first moved into this neighborhood 3 years ago, I had hope. Naive, sun-dappled, new homeowner hope. I pictured peace. The kind of peace you read about in gardening magazines. Tomatoes ripening in neat rows, the gentle gurgle of rain barrels filling overnight, bees buzzing lazily in the afternoon as I sat with a glass of iced tea on the porch. I never wanted grandeur, just quiet joy. So I built it slowly. A modest garden, some raised beds, a compost pile. Then, almost on a whim, the bees. A small hive at first, built from a second-hand box and a few weekends of research. The hum of the colony quickly became my favorite sound. They were orderly, loyal to their queen, tireless in their work. And in return for my care, they gave me something golden and miraculous, honey. That first season, I bottled it up in simple mason jars and handed them out to neighbors, smiling like a kid with a lemonade stand. People loved it. They said it tasted better than anything from the store. Lila was one of the first to take a jar, her smile so wide and sugary, it felt rehearsed. "You're like a little nature wizard," she giggled, squeezing my arm lightly. I should have known then. There was something too sweet in her tone, like syrup that hides a sting. At first I wrote off the missing jars. Maybe I'd given away more than I remembered. Maybe I'd been too generous. But little things started piling up. The crate would be nudged an inch to the left, a sticky fingerprint on the cloth. 1 jar gone instead of 2. Then the notes, sickly sweet scribbles in loopy cursive. "Thanks, neighbor," and "This is divine, better than the store." My stomach would turn every time I found one, like someone blowing kisses after stealing your wallet. The moment of truth came when I saw her with my own eyes. I'd suspected, I'd hoped I was wrong, but there she was, crouched like some kind of foraging squirrel in expensive loungewear, helping herself without so much as a pause. I decided to confront her, gently, carefully, like handling a wild animal that might bite if cornered. I printed out a still image, handed it to her on her driveway. "Looks like someone really enjoys the honey," I said, forcing a smile. She didn't even blink, just scoffed and said, "Oh, please, it's just honey. We're a community. We should share nature's gifts, especially when they're this good." And with that, She turned away mid-sentence and started yelling at a delivery driver for parking too close to her mailbox. That should have been the end. But Lila had a flair for escalation. The next morning she dropped off a pamphlet from the HOA in a plastic sleeve, like a student presenting homework. She'd highlighted a line in neon pink. Residents are encouraged to maintain harmony and utilize shared resources respectfully. Her argument. Since bees pollinate everyone's flowers, the honey was a communal resource. I nearly laughed in her face. But the match to the fuse wasn't the theft or the HOA pamphlet. It was the book club. The morning that turned everything from absurd to personal. I was outside trimming the hedges, minding my business, when I heard her voice float over the fence, loud, purposeful. "Oh, that guy with the bees," she said, dripping sarcasm like poison. "He thinks he's some kind of artisan. Honestly, I think he's just lonely. Probably names each bee and sings to them or whatever." The laughter that followed sliced deeper than any sting I'd ever endured. That honey she stole wasn't just sugar. It was my time, my craft, my care, my therapy. And she'd reduced it to a punchline for lemon scone-laced giggles. The theft wasn't just physical anymore. It was emotional, intimate, insulting. She'd turned my sanctuary into her buffet and then mocked me for defending it. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, teeth clenched, heartbeat in my ears. The vision played over and over in my mind. Lila, grinning, licking her fingers, walking away victorious. My mind danced with foolish fantasies, my bees forming a tiny brigade, surrounding her porch like golden-winged avengers. But then something quieter, sneakier, started to form. Not vengeance exactly, not violence, but poetry, a plan. Stupid, risky, borderline deranged, but mine. As dusk settled the next evening, I moved with purpose. Slow, silent, dressed in my full beekeeping suit. I waited until the hive was calm, until the sun had slipped beneath the trees and the bees had tucked in for the night. With steady hands, I used smoke and sugar water to coax them into a portable hive disguised as a planter box. I placed it in a wheelbarrow and rolled it slowly through the side yard, each creak of the wheelbarrow axle feeling like the turning of fate. I positioned it on her porch, right near her morning stretch corner, and her little glass jar of cucumber water. I added sprigs of lavender for elegance, sprinkled pollen to help the bees orient, and finally, with reverence, I set down 2 jars of honey, labeled them neatly. Fresh harvest. Enjoy. Then I returned to my home, brewed a fresh cup of coffee, and waited. At exactly 5:45 a.m., like clockwork, her front door creaked open with that same over-lubricated whine, a sound that had become as familiar as birdsong. Out stepped Lila Davenport in her usual uniform of entitlement, a pink hoodie, glittering Karma Queen blazing across her back, her hair tied in a high, careless bun. She yawned, stretched lazily, and made her way across the porch, barefoot and oblivious, as if she were about to greet the morning with a bit of borrowed sunshine. Her eyes hadn't even adjusted to the light when she reached for the honey jars I had left in perfect symmetry beside the new hive. She didn't notice the planter box had a faint hum, didn't question the subtle shimmer of movement beneath its wooden slats. She simply picked up the jar like she always did, with the casual air of someone who thought the universe owed her sweetness. The first bee flew past her ear like a whisper. She flinched. Her fingers twitched. She blinked rapidly. A second one zipped near her cheek, brushing close enough to make her lips curl in hesitation. And then it happened. One small honeybee landed gently, almost lovingly, on her bare ankle. The silence before the scream was almost sacred. Then came the chaos, a shriek so high-pitched it startled birds from trees. The jar dropped, hitting the wooden deck with a sharp crack, golden honey pooling like spilled treasure. Lila flailed in a wild dance of panic, arms chopping at the air, legs kicking in every direction. She knocked over the little bamboo table that held her cucumber water, sent her wind chimes into a violent metallic clatter, and stomped straight onto her flip-flop, which twisted and sent her tumbling backward into her potted ferns. She scrambled up, shrieking, one sandal missing, ponytail askew, and darted back inside, slamming the door behind her so hard a decorative plaque fell from the wall. From inside, her dog Princess Cupcake barked like the world was ending. I sipped my coffee slowly, steam curling into the air, the taste sweeter than anything I'd ever harvested from a hive. That morning set a tone, and oh, what a tone it was. The next few days played out like the most entertaining show I'd ever watched, and I had front row seats. Lila's porch became a no-fly zone, not because of any official restriction, but because the bees had claimed it. They'd settled beautifully, incredibly, as if they had always belonged there. They buzzed around her hanging flower baskets, dipped into her petunias, danced among the lavender I'd so artfully placed. They had turned her porch into their personal oasis. And while they showed no aggression to those who passed by respectfully, they weren't exactly welcoming to those who strutted around like queens without a crown. Lila, once the reigning monarch of our morning block, had vanished into her curtains. Gone were her yoga stretches, her gossiping porch chats, her passive-aggressive waves to neighbors she judged silently. Her blinds twitched at regular intervals, her face occasionally appearing in the gap like a prisoner watching the yard. She clearly expected the bees to leave on their own. They didn't. They were home now. The porch had become a humming fortress of poetic consequence. By noon that day, I received a knock at the door. 2 HOA reps in matching navy blue polos, their little clipboards tucked beneath their arms like security badges. Gary and Felicia, neighborhood enforcers with all the warmth of a tax audit. Felicia did most of the talking, asking pointed questions, while Gary nodded solemnly like he was conducting a national security briefing. Lila had filed a formal complaint. She claimed I had weaponized bees and placed an aggressive hive on her property to cause emotional distress. I raised an eyebrow, motioned toward the side yard, and showed them the original hive base, neatly maintained, clearly empty now, but labeled and documented. I even handed over a copy of my city-issued beekeeping permit. Everything was legal, calm, above board. When asked if I had moved the bees, I simply shrugged and said, "Bees are free creatures. Maybe they just like her flowers." Gary scratched his head, mumbled something about pollination behavior, while Felicia narrowed her eyes in silence. The best part? That afternoon, a delivery guy attempted to drop a package on Lila's porch. He made it halfway up the steps before 3 bees buzzed out to greet him. He froze, then yelped, tossed the box onto the welcome mat like it was about to explode, and sprinted back to his van. Lila opened the door just wide enough to snatch it inside, then vanished again like a ghost behind a curtain. From that point on, no one approached that porch casually. Kids crossed the street to avoid it. Adults chuckled quietly behind hands. And me. I felt something shift. Vindication, yes, but also curiosity. What happens when a thief is finally caged by the very thing she thought she could control? But of course, Lila wasn't one to lick her wounds quietly. She had an ally now, her sister Valerie. She arrived like a hurricane in a pearl-white SUV, tires screeching as she parked across 2 driveways without apology. Tall, loud, and aggressively confident, she marched straight to Lila's porch shouting her name like a military commander. The bees didn't seem to care, but I did. I watched from my porch, arms crossed, as Valerie waved her arms around, pointed at my house repeatedly, and ranted in a voice designed for courtroom drama. The very next day, she came knocking with a stack of printed documents in hand, eyes blazing with self-righteous fury. She didn't bother with greetings. "This," she declared, fanning out papers like a magician about to perform a trick, is a violation of civil harmony and public safety. She claimed to be a paralegal, whatever that meant, and accused me of biological harassment and insect-based psychological warfare. I blinked, then asked if she was seriously suggesting that bees were capable of premeditated crime. That didn't go over well. She launched into another tirade, accusing me of falsifying my permit, and insisted that no sane city official would approve the placement of an armed hive on someone's porch. I offered to help her call animal control or the city inspector. She did, twice. Both times the authorities confirmed everything was legal, above board, and entirely within my rights. Valerie stormed off, red-faced, muttering about conspiracies and corrupt zoning boards. At this point, the neighborhood began to fracture into two camps. One side, which I mentally dubbed Team B, consisted of neighbors who found the entire ordeal amusing, just and oddly unifying. They dropped by with empty jars, cookies, lemonade, and conspiratorial grins, hoping to grab a taste of honey or a glimpse of porch-bound karma. The other camp, Team Chaos, included Lila, Valerie, and a few uptight HOA loyalists, who couldn't admit that this was all the result of Lila's own greed and entitlement. Gary from the HOA returned, his frown deeper, his voice quieter. He urged me, with great solemnity, to consider relocating the hive for the greater good. I reminded him that bees choose their own paths. Felicia came back the next day with an envelope containing an HOA directive about unintentional disturbances. I smiled, handed her a jar of honey labeled for peaceful neighbors, and asked if she wanted a sample. She took it. She never came back. But I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Lila had tasted humiliation now, and for people like her, that kind of bitterness doesn't fade. It festers. She had gone from porch princess to housebound hermit, and every twitch of her curtain, every glare from behind her blinds, told me one thing. She wasn't done yet, and neither were the bees. It happened on a Thursday evening, just as the sun dipped behind the row of houses, and the air turned heavy with the scent of warm mulch and lilac. I was in the backyard, trimming the edges of my raised garden beds, when my cat Bolt, usually indifferent to anything that didn't smell like tuna, froze like a statue and stared at the fence line. His ears twitched, his eyes narrowed, and that's when I heard it, a rustle that didn't belong. Not the rustle of squirrels or wind in the hedges. No, this was slower, more deliberate, accompanied by a faint metallic clink. I turned off the trimmer and stepped carefully toward the sound, heart thumping with suspicion. Around the side of the shed, in the dusky gloom, was a shape moving awkwardly through the bushes. I crept around, my breath shallow, my eyes adjusting just in time to see her. Lila, dressed in what can only be described as a homemade hazmat suit. Long sleeves, gardening gloves, sunglasses under a mesh mosquito veil, and a flashlight duct taped to her forehead like a bizarre miner. And in her hands, a garden hoe, which she was using to jab and lift the lid of one of my backup hives with the finesse of a toddler playing whack-a-mole. She was muttering furiously under her breath, her words half curses and half unhinged declarations about reclaiming her mornings, about ending the reign of those flying tyrants, about how she was taking back control over her porch and her life and her dignity. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched, stunned and fascinated, as she pried at the hive like a woman possessed. And then, as if summoned by some ancient protective instinct, the bees responded. They poured out in a swarm that looked almost sentient, as if the entire hive had collectively decided they'd had enough of Lila Davenport. The buzz deepened, thickened, filled the air with a vibrating warning. Lila didn't even get a full second to react. One landed on her cheek, another on her wrist. She screamed, a sound so shrill it pierced the twilight, and stumbled back, flailing her arms wildly as the bees enveloped her like a living cloak of vengeance. She knocked over a pot of basil, tripped on the garden hose, and crashed shoulder first into my tomato bed, flattening two of the sturdiest plants I'd ever grown. Dirt flew. She flailed. Her veil slipped sideways, and the duct-taped flashlight clattered to the ground like a fallen torch from a failed expedition. She scrambled up, shrieking incoherently, and bolted for the gate, arms pinwheeling as she slapped at imaginary bees that had long since retreated. She ran full speed into the wooden post, bounced off with a loud grunt, left one shoe behind, and vanished into the darkness of her own backyard like a cartoon character fleeing a haunted house. I approached the hive slowly, smoke canister in hand, murmuring gentle reassurances as I'd always done. The bees calmed quickly. They weren't angry, just defending their home. I looked over the carnage, flattened basil, upturned mulch, one flip-flop spinning slowly in place, and felt a mix of awe and disbelief. The audacity, the absolute foolishness. She wasn't just a thief anymore, she was a saboteur. The next morning I dressed and walked straight to the local precinct with the evidence in hand. The officer on duty reviewed everything. My report, the state of the hive, the footage, and shook his head like a man who'd seen 1,000 dumb decisions, but still couldn't believe this one. He told me this was no longer just trespassing. It was agricultural sabotage, tampering with a regulated pollination structure, a serious offense with legal consequences attached. Within 24 hours, a uniformed officer knocked on Lila's door with a summons. I happened to be watering the front garden, entirely by coincidence when it happened. Lila opened the door, still wearing oversized sunglasses and a scarf wrapped around her head, like she was in witness protection. She saw the officer, blinked, looked over and saw me with my watering can, and her whole face drained of color. She tried to argue, tried to play the victim, said she was trying to rescue the bees from an unfit environment. The officer didn't even respond. He just handed her the papers and turned back to his cruiser. But the drama didn't end there. Enter Valerie again, storming down the street like an off-brand crusader, shouting about defamation, property rights, and conspiracies involving the insect kingdom. She claimed Karen had taken up beekeeping for spiritual reasons, that this was all a misunderstanding rooted in her sister's deep desire to reconnect with nature. She screamed that the neighborhood was turning into a cult, and that someone was going to get sued. The neighbors just rolled their eyes. No one joined her little rebellion. In fact, by now, people were actively enjoying the spectacle. One teen edited together a compilation of Lila's greatest hits, her porch panic, her garden tumble, the bee chase, and added dramatic music, calling it the sweetest justice. Another neighbor handed me a mug that said, "Hive-minded." I smiled, thanked him, and added it to my growing collection of bee-themed gifts from online fans. The court date arrived quickly. Lila walked in looking like she'd aged a decade. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, oversized glasses, and a look of someone completely detached from the reality she had created. The judge, a patient woman with a dry tone and no tolerance for melodrama, watched the footage in silence. Then she looked at Lila and simply asked, "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Lila launched into a stream of babble about emotional trauma, feeling attacked in her own home, and living under surveillance from winged creatures. The judge blinked twice. Then she ruled. 40 hours of community service. Restitution for the damage done to the hive. A formal trespassing warning. If she set foot on my property again, it would be grounds for immediate arrest. Valerie stormed out of the courtroom muttering about appeals and injustice. Lila trailed behind like a balloon that had lost its helium. 2 weeks later, I saw her. Orange vest, trash bag in hand, picking up litter in the community garden, cheeks flushed, eyes downcast, and wouldn't you know it? That same day, I had been invited to speak to a group of third graders about bees, pollination, and community ecosystems. There I was, 10 feet away, explaining the magic of pollinators, while Lila crouched behind a rose bush, yanking weeds and pretending not to exist. The kids recognized me. One of them whispered, "That's the bee guy from the video." And I smiled, not smugly, just peacefully. After that, Lila vanished almost completely. She stopped attending HOA meetings. Her blinds stayed closed more often, but the hive remained. I upgraded it with a handcrafted wooden enclosure, added an educational plaque that listed fun facts about bees, and even got permission from the HOA, under its newly revised pollinator-positive policy, to leave it as a semi-permanent fixture. People would stop to admire it. Tourists sometimes took photos, and someone anonymously planted extra lavender nearby. The porch that had once symbolized petty theft and neighborly warfare had become a quiet sanctuary. Then came the letter. A small envelope slipped under my door early one morning. No return address, no embellishments. Inside, a handwritten note. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't beg. It simply said she was wrong. That ego and pride had gotten the best of her. That watching herself online again and again had forced her to see how far she'd drifted from who she used to be. Enclosed was a small check to cover the remaining costs of hive repair, and one line written at the bottom, "I hope the bees forgive me too." Weeks passed. The neighborhood grew quieter, but somehow more alive. Children pointed at the hive on their way to school. Parents smiled as they walked past. My honey business had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. My nephew ran the online shop, and jars with labels like Sweet Retaliation and Porch Batch Reserve flew off the virtual shelves. But the biggest change wasn't in sales. It was in community. People stopped isolating behind fences and started talking, planting, learning. I even started offering weekend beekeeping workshops, not just to teach honey harvesting, but to teach calm, respect, patience, the things bees had taught me. And then one day, something unexpected happened. Princess Cupcake, Lila's little dog, wandered into my yard, not yapping or panicked, just curious. She walked over to the hive enclosure, curled up a few feet away, and lay down peacefully in the shade. She didn't flinch when a bee buzzed by her ear, just rested there, as if soothed by the hum. A few minutes later, Lila appeared. She called Cupcake softly. When she saw me standing nearby, she hesitated. I smiled and pointed at her dog. "She's been coming here a lot lately," Lila said quietly. "I think she likes the sound." I nodded and said, "So do I." She didn't say more. She scooped up Cupcake and walked back home. But the invisible fence between our yards felt like it had faded into the background of a much larger story. In the end, the war over honey became something more than revenge or justice. It became transformation, a reminder that boundaries matter, that actions have consequences, and that sometimes the sweetest victories are not loud or petty, but slow, steady, and absolutely golden, just like honey.